I'd like to begin, as we always do at LaunchVic, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands upon which we meet. For me, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you very much for tuning in to LaunchVic's talent webinar, Recruitment 101 for Startup Founders. We want to ensure that our Victorian founders have the talent they need to grow, and that's absolutely integral to the success of our sector, and the success of our sector is integral to our economic recovery. We know that startups are growing faster than any other sector in the Victorian economy right now, and while we recognise that many people have done it tough over 2020, it's also a very exciting time. We have a number of startups that are growing at a rapid rate because of COVID, but also because of the industries that they're in, and they were already on that growth trajectory. So ensuring people have the right talent is just absolutely imperative. Deloitte Access Economics predicted that with the right support, the Victorian ecosystem has the potential to add on average a further 15,700 full-time employees to the economy per annum. And that's something that we're laser focused on at LaunchVic. We want to make sure that if you're a founder, you've got the support you need to hire the right people to grow your company, to contribute back to your own wealth creation, but also the prosperity of Victoria more broadly. Today's webinar is about equipping you with the tools and tricks of the trade to address key recruitment challenges, something we know can be a real struggle for busy founders. We're going to hear from the very best in the business when it comes to talent acquisition on how to attract high quality talent, how to manage the recruitment process, onboarding, and helping you make sure you hold on to those wonderful employees. But first, some housekeeping. We have, as I'm sure everyone is very familiar with, the Zoom chat channel and the Q&A channel. I'm going to be doing my very best to moderate the Q&A channel, so please do keep questions coming in. We love seeing audience interaction. If you'd like to communicate directly with each other, please use the chat channel, but I will be monitoring and moderating the Q&A channel, so please keep your questions there. So without further ado, let's get started. I'd like to very warmly welcome our wonderful lineup of panelists. We have Justin Angsuat, the incoming Chief People Officer of Blackbird, officially starting on 1 July, but providing us a preview of what wonderful things he's going to be doing to support the ecosystem. We have Sarah Mills-Krutlik, SMK, Managing Director of Pathmint, and we have Geraldine Nankervis, People and Culture Partner at Render Networks. I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves and talk about how you began working with startups and why you are so passionate about supporting founders to scale their teams. So Justin, let's kick off with you.
Oh, hey, g'day. I'm Justin. I'm returning from nearly a decade in the US, returned right in the middle of the Melbourne lockdown. So a decade the US was spent mostly in New York City and most recently in San Francisco in the Silicon Valley area. Had a pretty eclectic bunch of experiences in the US in larger companies like Human Capital Consulting in New York, led HR for a few functions at Google. But then I got really excited starting to work with VCs, including Google Capital, before jumping in headfirst to be a head of people at a unicorn in San Francisco and started advising startup founders and other companies. And I really loved that. And I was very passionate about just making work better, not only in my own company, but in companies right across the ecosystem. And so now I'm really excited to be joining the Aussie venture capital firm Blackbird in July, as Kate mentioned, where I'm going to really have two big focuses. The first is internally on helping the VC continue to grow and be an incredible place to work. But for the purposes of today, the exciting part is really working externally. So working with startups right across the Aussie and New Zealand ecosystem, really grow and scale in the people and change space. So really excited to be home in Australia, getting immersed in the startup ecosystem and spending time with great panelists like Geraldine and SMK today, and Kate and all of you today. So thanks for having me.
And I nearly did that thing where I forget to unmute myself, which I'm sure I will do before the end of this session. I'm going to throw to SMK next. And could you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got involved in startups, and also your role at Pathmint?
Thanks, Kate. Well, like I said, SMK is how I prefer to go by. You can call me Sarah too. I'm originally from San Francisco, California, started my career in Silicon Valley, recruiting for Tesla way back in the day when they had a car, didn't have a car. I moved on to Twitter and Dropbox, but really beyond scale ups and kind of the recruiting role that I was playing in some of those companies, I was being tapped on the shoulder often by founders in the startup world and took a keen interest in seeing some of those companies succeed. So one of the first companies I advised was Mixpanel in San Francisco, and had a great time just kind of advising them on how to build out their sales team. And I thought, this is really fun. So when I moved here to Australia about 20 months ago, my partner had a startup he'd recently sold and wanted to come back home. I thought I really felt called to help startups figure out their way as far as recruiting goes. I've seen a lot of things, I've hired a lot of people. And so I really like to work with my clients at Pathment. I have a handful of startups and scale-ups that I work with, and teach them how to best recruit and bring on the best talent and scale very thoughtfully with diversity, equity, and inclusion in mind. So at Pathment, I work with a number of startups. One of my larger engagements is with Udemy. I handle all their recruitment for APAC. But I've also worked with other clients like Cadmus, Chronosphere, Brasa, Frankie One, just to name a few.
Fantastic, thank you. And last but by no means least, Geraldine, we'd love to hear from you and a little bit about Render Networks.
Fantastic. Hi, everyone. I'm Geraldine. I work across actually a number of different startups and organisations and supporting them with in-house end-to-end HR, but predominantly I'm with Render Networks at the moment, which is a digital construction management platform, headquartered out of Melbourne here, but growing internationally with a team over in the States as well. So it's been, I guess, an incredible opportunity to be part of their journey as they have been really scaling internationally as well. My background is I started in recruitment about 15 years ago. And now I work really the end-to-end HR lifecycle, recruiting, people strategy, and everything sort of in between. So I guess I'm just really passionate about, supporting founders and organisations in bringing their people strategy to life. I do think that the recruitment component of it is the most important, to get right and to really focus on. And one day will be, I guess the role at Render entails, setting up, a new payroll platform over in the US. And then the next day is ordering new furniture for the office because we're growing. So it's great to be involved. I've worked with companies such as like Eventbrite here in Melbourne as their HR lead for a period of time. Amobi, which is a global digital media company, Unlocked, a startup here. Out of Melbourne as well. So have experience across a few different tech organisations. And I've also co-founded a little initiative, I guess, called Hey Sister Project, which is to sort of really help girls and young women 15 to 24 to figure out what they want to do with their careers, obviously with a focus on tech.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I mentioned before we've got an audience and that are predominantly founders. So we know there are people here looking for tips and tricks. And we know many of the startups in Victoria are looking for great talent. We hear frequently that there are talent shortages, particularly for those critical roles as you move from a friends and founders team into a growth team. And then as you move from an early stage startup into a later stage startup, there are various pain points. But for those that are growing, we know that, we've got all these vacancies. There is a great supply of talent in Victoria, but the two are often disconnected. And so we worry that there's not always a great supply of startup talent. So I'm really keen to begin with the very first question. You're a startup, you've identified a new role, or perhaps you need to fill an existing role. Where do you start? Is it the position description? And what are the elements that you need to get right at that very first day when you say, I need to hire someone? So Justin, I'm going to throw to you first.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. It's a hard question, where to start. And look, there's a lot of places you can start with a position description, including making sure it's inclusive, using tools like Textio, etc. But I'd like to focus on two areas that I think will have the biggest impact. And the first one is perhaps the most important, which is focusing on what matters. And I think the key here is if you don't know what you're looking for, you're not going to recognize it when you see it. And so unless of course you hire someone exactly like yourself, and knowing myself, that's generally a bad idea. So where I see companies go wrong with this is there's just too much criteria to know exactly what it is that they're looking for, or companies add criteria along the way. You've got to really narrow it down. And there are lots of ways you can do this, and happy to share some. But I think the key is to get it down to 3 to 5 criteria max. And I think this process in itself is really important for you as a founder, for the hiring team, to really go through and think through and prioritize what type of candidate it is that you want in the role. For example, it's really common to have domain expertise as one of the most important criteria, but it's really important not to just default to that. For example, when we looked at this at Google, we found that domain expertise were, some of the biggest drivers of performance, but only a very narrow subset of roles, very technical engineering roles. Aside from that, we found that actually general cognitive ability or problem solving was a much stronger predictor of performance. So it's really important to be really thoughtful about this right up front when you're trying to decide who it is that you want to hire, because hiring is one of the most important things you can do at any company, but especially important to startups, given the smaller size and often the fast pace of it. So this stage 1 hire can really impact your energy, morale, and trajectory, whether good or bad. So spending a couple of hours upfront in the hiring process before jumping into this has really high return on investment. So nail 3 to 5 criteria of what you need the person to spike for in the role. And after that, getting to the position description, make sure your position description makes that really clear. It helps candidates, it helps you, and it helps your brand. And perhaps the last point of all this is once you've nailed that criteria, it's important to use it to inform your interview process that Kate mentioned we'll talk about later, but also qualifications in the position description. For example, I see with board searches, sometimes I see experience as a CEO as a required qualification. And that's totally fine if it's necessary. But if it's not necessary, given that less than, I think it's 20% of CEOs are women, for example, that line alone creates a much diverse candidate pipeline. So in summary, narrow it down, focus on 3 to 5 criteria that are really important to you. Make sure they're really clear on the position description, and then question all other criteria and qualifications to make sure you're being really intentional about.
Excellent advice, Justin. Thank you. SMK, you're out advising startups all the time. What's your practical advice about getting the position description right?
Well, I agree with everything Justin just said, but I'd like to add to that a little bit. The very first thing I do when I sit down to look at a job with a hiring manager is I build a job kit. So it actually kind of goes above and beyond what that job description is going to be. And it's the recipe for success on how you're going to hire, who's on your panel, what questions are they asking. This will actually help you to write the job description or the position description. So I'm going to tell you like my don'ts of 2021. These are things I just cringe when I see. And I read a lot of forums where candidates are talking about job descriptions. So I'm kind of pulling some of that information from there. But what's out in 2021 are using words like ninja, guru, rock star, unicorn, family. That's a real turnoff for candidates when they're hearing words like that, and also can be very gendered. So you really want to be careful about the gendered language that you're using, like Justin kind of talked about a little bit before. And you also want to stay away from glittering generalities. So if you feel like you're being very vague, it's probably vague, and a candidate's not going to know what you're talking about either. And the other piece that I really love to see in a job description are what success looks like and what you're going to be doing in the first month and in the next few months. And this is really crucial because it tells the candidate that you have a very clear pathway to success, because nobody wants to join a company where they feel they're not going to be successful. That will also help you structure your onboarding plan for a candidate coming on board, and will help you to know as you're vetting candidates who's going to be successful based on that criteria. And the final thing that I love having on job descriptions, and candidates tell me all the time, I interview about 10 candidates a day, I add a bio for the hiring manager and the team. And it's kind of a you go first attitude. You've got to humanize your job description a little bit. So if a candidate knows a little bit about you, where you've come from, maybe what your management style is, what you do for fun, it'll allow people to open up to you a lot more easily when you're having that first interview.
Thank you. So Geraldine, I'm going to ask you to build on what Justin and SMK have said, but we often see company missions statements and value systems also being weaved through the recruitment process, particularly in large corporates. Is this something that people should be considering as they look to grow their team? And if so, how do you build that in?
I believe that having a really great mission that's well articulated and also, values created really early on is really important. And look, they will naturally or potentially iterate as the organisation grows as well. But especially like in the world of, startups, absolutely, while you've got position descriptions, people can be sort of operating a little bit outside of their swim lanes at times, and values just really are able to create, the guiding principles and the behaviours that are accepted within the organisation, and also really help with like decision making practices and processes as well. If values are front of mind, we have values at Render, and even as part of the recruiting process, we have candidates actually highlighting to us that they love the values, and it's actually a real sort of attraction to the organisation and the discussion. And I think the mission as well, people want purpose. So if they're if they know what the mission of the company is and what they're trying to achieve, they are able to, be drawn into that purpose, and you're able to, really sort of tie in and create some really good questions and discussion throughout the interview process. There was a podcast that I absolutely love. It's called How I Work. And I think it was the head of remote work at GitHub, who, they're a fully remote organization. And they said that if you've got your values right and your documentation right, it's essentially like the superpower of remote work, because it guides how people operate across the business. So I've sort of, sat with that for a while and really find it valuable.
Fantastic, thank you. And I can see questions coming in on the chat, on the Q&A channel, so please keep them coming. I'm going to throw one back to SMK around, our very first question was about how many diverse or people who are over the age of 50 or disadvantaged people have you recruited? And what are ways in which you can ensure that you are taking a really diverse and inclusive approach to recruitment?
That's a really good question. And diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, I think, are very important things to talk about when you're getting started looking at a role. So I really enjoy tools like Textio when you're building out job descriptions to ensure that there's some inclusive language to attract all types of audience members to your job description. I also think if you wanted like a specific number around how many people I've hired over the age of 50 or disabled people, I don't have those exact figures off the top of my head, but I do encourage every founder that I work with to think about diversity as the people on my team come from a variety of different backgrounds and have multiple unique perspectives. And that really is what diversity is, and that's what you need to think about. So if you have a startup and everybody's over the age of 50, it's not very diverse. So you need to think about how diverse is the group and what is the diversity of thought that you're bringing to the table. I'll talk about equity too. So equity means individuals are given the resources that they need to be their most successful selves. And then that can't be brought along without inclusion and belonging. And inclusion is all people are accepted into an organization, regardless of their identity. And belonging is the feeling that you are an essential part of a team. So again, I know I mentioned family, that's often used throughout job descriptions. It's not a family, it's a workplace. But you can include words around inclusion and belonging to really talk about what you're trying to portray in that.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm going to keep coming back to diversity as we go along, because it's such an important issue in getting a team right. But I'm actually now going to move on to the interview stage. And I had a great discussion. It was actually on a panel, I believe, with a founder who was an engineer, if I recall. And he was saying how when he interviews other engineers. He can be really critical and he really understands the domain, so he can interview them and be very confident. And then he started to have to interview for a chief communications officer. And he said he loved every single interviewee because they were all such great communicators. And then he realized that he actually didn't have the confidence to be able to assess good from, strong from weak, or right fit from wrong fit for that particular organization. So, it's something that founders do have to struggle with, because when you're in a large corporate, you're typically in your domain, you've got an HR organization supporting you. When you're a founder and you're in a really young team, a really small team, you've suddenly got to go out and hire people who you have no real domain expertise around. So how do you navigate this? And Justin, I'm going to throw this to you, because you touched on this ever so slightly before when you were talking about domain strength isn't necessarily the key indicator for success in a role. But how do you flip that on its head in the interviewing when you're, as a founder, of perhaps feeling a little bit unconfident about your ability to find the right person for a role for which you have no experience?
Yeah. I totally get that. And also it resonates when you talked about interviewing a lot of the comms folks that are very articulate and great communicators. And I think it goes back to the criteria again. Like, what is it that you're looking for in this person? Like, do they themselves have to be a really great communicator? Or do they need to be able to write a great communications plan? Or do they need to be able to build a team of incredible comms people and write a strategy? So I think the first step, again, going to hate me from saying this over and over again, but I think it is being clear on your criteria. So if you think about, for example, hiring your first engineer or firing head of engineering as a non-technical founder, my first question to founders is often, how technical do you need them to be? As a leader, for example, do you want them to be really involved in your product design, as some engineering leaders are, and product design and also product development? Or do you want them just to execute a product roadmap because you have a chief product officer that's really dedicated to doing that? So what do you need from them from that perspective? Do you need them to be a team builder? Do you need them to be strong at hiring and building an engineering culture? Or do you need them just to get the product off the ground and hustle for the first 5-10 engineers? So I think, first of all, be really clear on your criteria. Second piece is, I think it's really helpful to learn more about the role and what it is that you're looking for. So I'm working with some founders now who are hiring some roles that they're less familiar with. And I've encouraged them to go meet with 5-10 great people in those roles in the industry, so they can better get calibrated. So, invite them to a coffee, or, in 2021, invite them to a Zoom meeting and learn more about their skill sets, the roles that they've held. Ask them, which peers that they would hire, get an introduction, meet some folks. And what I've found with these founders is really help them calibrate their criteria. So at the end, they've decided, well, actually, I don't need as technical of a leader. What I really need is someone who can scale an engineering team, as an example. And then last but not least, ask for help. When you're doing technical interviews for something like an engineer, as an example, find a senior engineer that you trust. Work with your board, work with your investors, find someone you trust that can be a sounding board for you for the technical piece, if that's what you want to interview for.
Fantastic. So Geraldine, you've got your short list of candidates and now you're going into the interview room. I think there's so much advice out there on how interviewees should approach an interview. But how should a founder approach the interview? How do you, as the person that's doing the interviewing, approach an interview? What tips do you have for that?
I just think be prepared, have spent the time reviewing their CV, put time, like the candidate is investing so much time to come in and meet with you, especially if you're the founder. They would have, invested a substantial amount of time. So put a little bit of preparation, into, how you're going to have that conversation with them. And I guess sort of talking back to what Justin had mentioned before, I guess just really understand, the criteria that you are going to be looking for, pre-prepare some questions that you might have in mind as well. And, as the founder, your role is also to sell in the vision of the organization and to really bring that candidate, into, I guess, the journey, if you like, of the organization as well. So use it as a selling opportunity. And also feel free to bring in someone else into the interview as well. So if you're, not technical by nature or not an engineer by nature, bring in one of your software engineers to be able to answer or ask some, technical questions as well. And so that you can bounce off each other is important as well. But I just think, preparation is key. being on time, because you're really selling in the opportunity, especially, you know, if you're a startup and might be competing for talent as well with sort of other big corporates who have some big brand names.
Thank you. So SMK, I'm going to throw to you. We've got a question on the line about, which is a very good one. How involved should the founder be in the recruiting process? What are the downsides of them not being involved in the process? And I guess this also depends on the size of the team. But I'm going to also add to this. So at what point should a founder be stepping back from the recruitment process to allow their direct reports to have some ownership over their team? How do you handle that?
Well, first of all, Geraldine, you're speaking my language. I will get back to like candidate respect in just a little bit, but I always tell founders that you have rock star qualities, and that when you're reaching out to a candidate, candidates actually really take an active interest because you're reaching out. I'll use Bros as an example. One of the best leadership teams I've worked with in a long time, Ivan Lim, is a really hands-on, involved in the recruitment process throughout. We recently did a CTO search and ended up hiring one of the candidates that Ivan, in fact, reached out to, which was fantastic. And the candidate said, it wouldn't have probably answered your email, but I would definitely answer Ivan's. And I said to Ivan, you have rock star qualities. So I always tell our teams, like, recruiting is a team sport. Although, like, I might be a recruiter and I might be here to like direct traffic and bring people in, everybody should be involved in the process of hiring, including founders. I think when it gets to be a little bit more difficult is when you're getting to that like Twitter Dropbox level. It just doesn't make sense for a founder to always be involved in every single interview. However, a founder can definitely jump back in when it comes to selling a really tough candidate at the very end. You just really want, you can definitely come into the end, talk about the vision, talk about the great things that they're going to be able to do while on your team. Those are all things that you can do if time is an issue for you.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I'm going to move the conversation on now. So you've found your recruit, you've been through the interview process, and you're onboarding. There are some onboarding horror stories. There are some exemplars of how to onboard. How important is onboarding and what should people do? So I'm going to throw that back to SMK.
So I run the onboarding program for Udemy APAC right now, and I used to run the onboarding program at Twitter as well and kind of welcome everybody on their first day. And I always used to say, the first day sets the tone for the rest of that time that you're going to be at the company. So you've really got to ensure from an onboarding perspective that everything is ready to go. So remember how earlier I talked about in the job description, you should have like what that first month and maybe the next few months look like? Well, you want to make sure you're building an onboarding plan around that. So when you get to maybe 3 months down the road, you can look back and say, did we do everything that we were supposed to do? Is this candidate meeting our expectations? That's important from from a leadership perspective, but it's also really important to give that candidate or that new employee time to get immersed in the company, meet with other people in the company, and make them feel like they are part of that team, kind of the belonging piece of the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging.
Fantastic. And Justin, what are your 2 or 3 tips for a great onboarding process?
Well, I agree with what SMK said, and also I did onboarding ran the orientation program at Google for welcoming new hires. It's probably one of the most favorite parts of my job, just like watching 200-300 new faces really excited to join. If I take a quick step back to talk about my tips, I think if you think about the goal of an onboarding experience, I believe it's to get new employees to be connected with the company and the team, be really engaged, and get productive as quickly as possible, for their sake as well as yours. There's a lot of data and analytics around on the onboarding experience, and so I think there are really kind of three big parts to an onboarding program to achieve the goals. One is creating something that's really structured, even if it's as simple as your company, your history, mission, culture, know your company, know your customer, know yourself, and know your role, and know your peers. Something as simple as that. Create a structured program. Number 2 is involve the manager. Clarify expectations, talk about success, talk about their career. New hires are usually 3 to 4x more likely to feel like their onboarding was successful if their manager was heavily involved. And the third piece is connect them to the community. So creating them with a connection to to your company's mission and help them feel accepted by their colleagues. And to answer your question, Kate, on some of the tips and tricks, I think tactically there's some things that you can do today that are pretty lightweight, that are proven to really help with that onboarding experience, even in a virtual or hybrid world that we're in today. A couple of them will be humans hate uncertainty, to create more certainty. So for example, small things like even setting expectations early or telling them about the onboarding experience a week before they start, not the day before they start. Have a main or structured central onboarding doc. So you can create a Google Doc of docs, including things like what to read, what to set up, who to meet, what Slack channels to join, what are the acronyms, etc. Another one is that people notice when onboarding folks aren't excited. And that's a key differentiator in onboarding programs. If these onboarding folks are late to the meetings, if they're flustered, if they're really monotonous. So when the company's less excited, the new hires are less excited. So make sure the new hires have a really excited experience. And then last but not least, like managers need to be central to this. As I mentioned before, they have like a 3x to 4x impact. Make sure they own the onboarding doc, the onboarding experience. Make sure they meet with the new hire regularly. Set expectations, which is something that's really hard for new hires to get accustomed to when joining a new company, and empathize, because people are inherently wanting to feel like they fit into your company. And it's different when you're in a workplace because you can read people's social and verbal cues and you can get a sense of, am I fitting in here? Does my behavior match? Am I meeting expectations? And that's really hard over Zoom, and it can be a little isolating. So as a manager, keeping in touch with folks and giving them that type of feedback consistently will help them better onboard into your organization.
Fantastic. And Geraldine, I'm going to throw a question that's come through the chat to you. Should external recruiters be involved in the onboarding of candidates?
Interesting question. And I think that the onboarding is definitely owned by the organisation. I actually haven't had a situation where the recruiter has been involved in the onboarding. I think they absolutely take the candidate up until that point where they're offered and they're giving them that great experience up until that start date. But I guess the onboarding sort of program and the way that someone is welcomed into the business is like the first test of like how your culture operates and welcomes people. So it needs to be owned by the manager of that team, as well as I guess the broader team as well. So yeah, interesting question, but I haven't actually been in a position where I've had a recruiter that has an external recruiter that's been involved in the onboarding process. Not sure about others.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that? Otherwise, I'm going to move us on to HR innovations. And, being the startup sector, we see all sorts of wonderful ideas come across our desk. People, culture, resourcing is an area where there's a huge amount of innovation. And I know, many startups are really eager to be at the forefront and cutting edge users of some of this innovation. We've witnessed a lot of developments in AI to reduce unconscious bias with job applications. There are a bunch of applications to support employee well-being and positive workplace engagement. How should founders be navigating these, and at what stage? Should they be looking at getting as many of these platforms in place as possible, or is it better time invested in the people to people? And how do you navigate this complex world of people technology? Justin, I'm going to throw it back to you first on this one.
Broad question. I love it. I'm going to try and keep my answer pretty short and happy to answer any follow-up questions. I think there's a lot of innovation in the HR space, which is really exciting. It feels like it's just been unleashed over the past few years. An area that I'm particularly passionate about, so I'll answer this question from that perspective, is the people analytics space. And watching that just really explode in the last 5-ish years. I'm of the firm belief that you can measure almost anything now. You can start to create more predictive models and start to see some really interesting results. I'm a little wary about AI in recruiting though, personally, because I think AI, if it's not used right, can also perpetuate a lot of the status quo and bias that exists. But I think that you can use analytics in really interesting ways combined with tools to start to look at your pipeline. to give you a specific example, to recruiting, there's a tool that I guess it goes back to what is it that you're trying to solve for, and perhaps I think it was about 18 months ago, maybe 2 years ago. One thing we're trying to solve for is greater visibility of diversity and inclusion in our recruiting pipelines. And so what we would often see is what is our composition of diversity in our organization, but that's a lagging indicator. That's once we've already hired folks. And a lot of Bay Area companies can blame the supply. We don't have a diverse supply in the Bay Area, so that's the reason why. But I really wanted to understand, is that true? And is there something within our recruiting process that's promoting bias? And so we engaged with a beta tool at the time that would go through your recruiting pipeline and actually start to give you demographic reports. And so you could see at every single stage of your pipeline, how many men, women, different racial demographics, different age demographics, not even self-disclosed. It's done through a number of algorithms to detect that based on colleges that people went to, names, etc. Just to see what did the demographics in our pipeline look like. And I wanted to get really specific about understanding, are we seeing, are we not reaching out to as many women as we thought we were? Or are they just not responding as quickly as we thought they were at different numbers? Are we filtering them out of interviews in a biased way? Like what was going on? And we learned something really interesting through that process. We saw this really big drop of candidates, especially women in engineering, after the phone screen. For us, we were engaging a lot of women in engineering early on, but a lot of them were dropping out at the phone screen. And we dug into that. And what we discovered was that we were highly calibrated all the way throughout our recruiting process. We had multiple points at which you could assess a candidate. For example, if you take the interviews, you'd have between 4 and 6 interviewers, and they were highly calibrated. And we'd spend a lot of time debriefing to mitigate the bias. But the phone screen was the only place that we didn't do that. We only had one person that could essentially say yes or no. And because the phone screen volume was huge, it tended to be more junior engineers that would do the phone screens. And so they would pattern match what they thought success would look like. And so inadvertently, we promoted bias at the top of our funnel before we could even start to use our processes and tools to make sure we're doing this in an unbiased way. And we only picked that up through the combination of HR technology, analytics, and trying to just dig a little bit deeper. And so once we did that, we implemented a few things to address that problem, and it was exciting to watch our pipeline like reflow again in a much more diverse way.
Great answer, Justin. SMK, what about you? Where are you at with HR technologies, and have you got any good tips that could help change biases or other aspects of workplace performance?
I, like the others, have probably been very lucky in the fact that I've seen a lot of cutting edge HR tools, worked with some amazing recruiting ops teams. So I usually say to a startup, how much money do you have? How much money do you want to throw at this? Because you can basically spend a lot of money to get these amazing tools that make things easier, that provide data. Which is fantastic. But the thing I usually like to recommend to a smaller startup that maybe has just gotten a round of funding and is getting started like in their recruiting process is to really get an ATS, which is an applicant tracking system, and get an applicant tracking system that provides data and reports. Like what Justin said, there are some great tools like Greenhouse does a report where you can look at some of those diversity numbers and kind of see where those fall off rates are. So I'm a data nerd. I really love to pull those reports from whichever applicant tracking system my clients are using and provide that as we're talking, because you can see kind of where the interest is with your job description, depending on how many people have applied, and maybe where your sourcing efforts have come in, and what that pipeline looks like. And so that's probably where I would start, is bringing in an applicant tracking system that kind of fits what you're looking for cost-wise. Lever and Greenhouse being a little bit more expensive, Workable being a little less expensive. And then there's some other tools I love to throw in that are really helpful for reaching out. LinkedIn Recruiter, getting LinkedIn Recruiter Lite. It can be a little expensive, but at least getting one seat for your startup, depending on size, can really help you, especially if you're a founder doing outreach emails, to reach out to candidates directly. So those are good places to start. But man, if you had endless money, there's so many things you can do with HR technology.
Geraldine, I'm going to throw one of the questions that have just come into you.
Mm-hmm.
What resources do you use or recommend for salaries and packaging up positions? And are there technologies out there that can help with that?
Yes, absolutely. So I have used resources such as PayScale in the past. So there are some resources out there. There are consultancies as well that you can go to, especially if you're looking at sort of benchmarking executive salaries and things like that too. There's lots of different avenues. You can use resources such as PayScale and I guess purchase their service to have a really good look sort of at the market. There are consultancies such as Hay Group that are a little bit more expensive, but can provide you with lots of information there. And then there's lots of other, I guess, resources that you can tap into that are like Glassdoor, for example, where you can go in and it's actually, I guess, candidates and employees putting in their salaries. So it's more so crowdsourced information. And if you're working with a really effective recruiter as well, partnering with them to give you some really interesting salary sort of benchmarks and rates, at the end of the day, you're going to find out what the market is paying when you're interviewing the candidates. So like that's real time what the candidates in front of you want. And I always talk salary in the very first interview. I like to talk sort of ballpark, even if you don't necessarily know what the exact salary is. Like you'll have an idea of what your budget is, but I always talk salary, in that first interview to be ensuring that that you're in a similar ballpark to be continuing through the process, and that's also where you're getting your live real-time information from.
Fantastic, thank you. So it's a good segue into the next question, which I really want to change back again. And one of the issues that often comes to us is how do startups compete with corporate salary packages? And often it's around job certainty and brand, but there are other factors that we know are playing a role in perhaps creating a smaller pool of people available to the startup sector versus some of these larger corporates. So how do startups attract great talent and compete with corporate salaries? I'm also going to throw back to one of the very first questions that came in from Ant, who's been very patient, and I've been waiting for this moment, Ant, to say what are people's thoughts on stock options and what's best practice? So I'm going to throw that back to SMK to begin with.
So I was kind of surprised actually when I first started here in Australia that there weren't stock options as readily available offered to candidates as a part of the remuneration package, new word for me. And I think that it's really important to think about what your company values are, kind of going back to what Geraldine was talking about, and what your key differentiators are. So not everybody is going to be looking for money. It's not going to be a driving factor. Everybody has a different situation. And there are quite a few people out who are very hungry to join a startup. We're seeing this information through the fellowship, which is part of the StartMate program, where there are quite a few women in every single cohort that are going through that program and really eager to be involved in working with startups. So we're seeing that through the platform like Startup Galaxy, where it's free to post your job and people are talking about how do I join a startup? And it's not always about what that compensation is. So I'll usually tell the team that I'm hiring with that great people attract other great people. So also going back to your point, Geraldine, around candidate respect, it's incredibly important if you're a startup to value a candidate's time. If they're not going to be a fit for the company, please let them know, but also say, we'll keep you in mind for future positions, because it's a limited candidate pool in Australia versus, say, I tell people in Silicon Valley or in America, it's just a different market. So it's incredibly important that you're respecting people's time, you're telling them where you're at in the journey, and then maybe you'll come back to them. And, you know, stock can be used to an advantage, but it's really up to the company to figure out if that's the right thing for them to be offering or not. It's not something that I'm seeing a ton of right now, but it's starting to become more and more commonplace.
Geraldine, I'm going to throw to you because Justin and SMK have both recently returned from Silicon Valley, or come from Silicon Valley. So you've been practicing a little bit longer in Victoria and Australia more broadly. What are your insights here?
I think that when it comes to, absolutely, you can attract talent from corporates. There are a lot of people who want to get into startups and scale-ups. You can definitely sell, and this is when it comes back to mission as well. You need to know your mission and sort of what the purpose of the organization is and what you're trying to achieve. And also, like, selling the opportunity. A lot of people will love to make the move because they want that breadth of experience that they can get from a startup, and not necessarily be one of many, but be able to contribute to, I guess, lots of different areas of the business. So it's just, I guess, really understanding, I guess, what that sort of target candidate, you know, is. You can get candidates out of the big, large, you know, organizations into your startup. I think, you know, equity and stock is a really interesting one. Not all candidates will be motivated by that. And however, it is very lucrative, especially when you're bringing on senior talent. In Australia, make sure that you invest on getting the right advice to set it up properly is my key. Get a great lawyer or an accountant to set it up properly, because there are lots of tax implications, you know, when it comes to equity, and you need to know, and you need to be able to articulate that to your employees as well to make it really valuable. And then, you know, what's the total offering beyond, you know, compensation? Is there flexibility of work? Do your engineers get to choose their own device? What projects do they get to work on? How quickly do they have to wait to the full year before they can progress, you know, into a new career opportunity or a promotion with the company, like you know, have to sometimes in big corporates? Or can you progress within 6 months? These are all the sorts of, you know, offerings that you can be talking about.
Fantastic. And Justin, do you have anything to add on this one?
Yeah, I mean, SMK and Geraldine have covered a lot. Just wanted to share one additional perspective, is that I agree, totally can attract talent from corporates. I think the reality is you're just not going to get everyone. You're only going to get those that really are excited about joining a startup. And as an interesting kind of dichotomy, I came from Google. I remember at Google, I hated how startups could always pull people from us. And no matter how much cash you threw at them, they would still leave and go to a startup. And it was really frustrating. Like, it was really hard to retain some of these folks that were just driven by a mission of a startup. Like, no amount of money, there's a lot of money thrown at them, no amount could keep them there. Then I went to a startup and I was really frustrated about the fact that we couldn't pull people out of Google. And so I think the reality is that it's just not going to happen for everyone, but it is possible. And I found that the biggest things that really pull people away from some of these large companies is really mission of the company and impact an individual can have. So that, like, joining a small startup in the early stages, feeling like everything they do will have an impact on the entire company and the company's trajectory is really, really important. I'm a big believer in options, and as Geraldine and SMK said, like, it really does depend on your company. There's a lot of things you should think through before you go down that path. I'm personally very biased, and I believe in employees owning upside. I had the opportunity to do that at Google. Same at Thumbtack, where every employee owns stock. And now at Blackbird, every employee at Blackbird has carried interest or a part of the company as well. But in terms of the question that was asked, I think options are complex. I think the best practice, or the things that people can best do in companies, is to invest time in explaining it. And that was always the challenging thing being in a startup, is when you look at an option, it's so much better than an RSU in many respects if you're really bullish on the company and you believe in the growth. But an RSU is so much easier to explain. And so what was really hard was we'd be granting employees like these large option grants, and it would be valued at zero. But there was significant upside opportunity here. And so I think investing in explaining options, if you do decide to go down that path, having a one-on-one, telling what a strike price is, how valuations work, and how growth works with an option is, I think, really key, because I think the granting is only a small fraction of how people think about their equity versus the actual communication and understanding of it. But many years later, we still have people still not fully understanding how much their options are worth, and some not even actually knowing that they actually own options to begin with. And so I think I'm a big believer in sharing equity with employees, but the communication's a really big lift, and I wouldn't underestimate that.
Fantastic, thank you. So we've got 10 minutes left, and I'm going to start picking off questions out of the Q&A channel and just directing it to one of our wonderful panelists. Please keep them coming through. SMK, this one's made for you. What are the challenges when selling relocation to candidates, and how do you help people to take the plunge? As someone who's recently done that, what do you have to do to convince people to come from overseas?
Yeah, relocation right now is really difficult. So let's just say that, but it's not impossible. I think Brasa is a good example of this. They were able to really focus on opening up their job description to a global market. And we're super flexible with candidates when they had specific needs about maybe not being in Melbourne by a certain point in time. So I think having a bit of flexibility on both sides is incredibly important if that's a possibility. I think relocation can be very difficult because it is very expensive, and you also do have to think about employee well-being once they do arrive maybe in a new place. We oftentimes would relocate people from New York to San Francisco at Twitter. And it was a big lifestyle shift for a lot of our employees that were coming over, besides, what do they say, getting divorced, starting a new job, and moving are probably the three most stressful things in life. So if you have two of those things happening at once, just really checking in with those employees to make sure they're feeling like they belong and they feel like they're included.
Fantastic, thank you. Geraldine, I'm going to ask you a question from Lewis. Should a small startup build an internal hiring team or hire an external hiring team to pay to help get those first hires on board?
I think it depends. So I think it probably depends on the growth and the value, I guess, and the cost. So absolutely, if you have, I guess, a number of opportunities, perhaps that are across all different disciplines, it might make sense to bring on someone sort of internally to be able to support even on a contract, and then also engage them, to create a great onboarding plan or program for you. If you're focused on building out like a technology team or an engineering team, we know what the market is like at the moment. So it could also be actually great to go out to an external recruiter and build a great partnership with them. There's a lot of recruiters and independent recruiters as well who have gone off on their own and are offering some really great and different, engagement methods. So you can sort of work quite differently with recruiters these days who can represent your brand really effectively, but then you're still tapping into a really sort of wide market and all of the relationships that they have. So I guess, yeah, it really depends. If you're bringing someone in-house, really perhaps look at how you can get them to also create a great, start working on your employment brand and, the onboarding plan. So it's a little bit more end-to-end as well is probably my recommendation.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, Justin, we've got one from Julie. She's asked, do you have any specific observations you're seeing in market regarding development or software engineer roles? Are there trends around tenure, performance, and general insights? Specifically, they are in high demand, they're well remunerated, but performance and soft skill capability may not be always guaranteed.
That's a great question. I'm still getting my dipping my toes into the Australian market, so I can only really speak to the US market at this stage, and it's a really hot market in the US. A lot of us thought that COVID was going to temper that, and a lot of folks would be really worried about changing roles and really just hunker down and stay with their company for a while. But the market's heated up hotter than I've seen, at least over the last 5 to 6 years. Like right now is one of the hottest times of the market. It was interesting a few years ago. I think a lot of things that really attracted engineers to join different companies was upside. It was companies that were just starting to go public. It was kind of the boom of IPOs at that stage. A lot of people wanted to be on that rocket ship as it started taking off and going public. And I think that's still the case, but I found that mission is starting to become more important as people care more about the type of work that they're working on, as well as career development is a really big trend. And they're working on a really tough technical problem is another one, where it's not necessarily just the money that people are really excited about, and it's not just going public or the big brand name now. What I'm seeing in this space is a lot of folks that are really excited to be in a company where they're learning from very senior mentors and they feel like they're growing and learning something different. And again, that tough technical problem where, you know, some folks are really attracted to search and they'll go seek out companies where they can go and practice and learn more about search, others around robotics, some around AI. And so I think being able to talk about those technical challenges is really important. And I've seen some companies do this really well with their employment branding, where instead of a recruiter kind of posting content about the perks, right now, it's about an engineer posting about the latest algorithm they've just developed and open sourcing that, and that's really attracted other engineers to want to learn more and or be a part of that culture. And so yeah, market's hot, but happy to talk more if there's questions on that.
Fantastic, thank you, Justin. And then my last question I'm going to throw to you, SMK. Should a startup pre-Series A be worried about being too top heavy? If we find excellent senior staff, should we hire them, or is it better to focus on building out mid-level teams?
So this would actually come up with a lot of nonprofit startups that I'd work with. I have mentored through the Fast Forward program back in the US. And it really depends. It depends on your company. So I couldn't give you that straight up advice. And every company, just remember this, is built differently because you're doing something different. You have a different product. What I do encourage most founders and leaders to do is build out their dream case org chart and really think about the next, say, 3 years, sometimes 5 years is a little too much, and think about people that you want to hire in specific roles, and maybe start to build out job descriptions for each of those roles so that when you're at a networking event, or you're speaking on a panel, you're able to kind of talk about those positions that you would like to fill, because it is a lot about timing. For some companies I've worked with, it's really more important to get the engineering team just up and going and getting those doers, building the product, coding, just getting the project management piece done. But for some companies, they really need some strategic leadership and some vision for that team. So it just kind of depends on what kind of outcome you need, but I've seen successful companies do it both ways.
Fantastic, thank you. And can I say a huge thank you to Sarah, Geraldine and Justin for sharing your insights and wisdom and helping us unpick some of the common challenges that everyone's facing as they go about growing their startups. I think we've uncovered some fantastic opportunities for founders and will help make our startup stronger, our startup ecosystem, not only being able to attract great talents, but secure and engage the right talent, which I think is a really important part of the mix. It does, however, remain one of the impediments, and to further address this, LaunchVic has recently funded a number of programs to build capability and provide hands-on experience and connections to help people land a job at a startup and scale up, and likewise help founders find the right people to join their teams. There are 3 programs in particular: StartMate, Stone & Chalk, and Inco. And for the founders on the team, on the line, I definitely encourage you to reach out to these organizations because they're going to be looking for startups that are able to place people. So StartMate are running a women-only fellowship for 120 Victorian women who want to land a job at a startup. They'll be looking for places to go to work. They're also running a student fellowship that are going to create pathways for 300 exceptional Victorian university students to land a job in the startup sector. Stone & Chalk are running events and developing an online and learning and skills experience open to any Victorian, and a mentor matching program to help them connect into startups and land jobs. And Inco are running boot camps and a placement service to help Victorians stood down during COVID-19 to land junior roles in the startup program. All 3 of these companies, StartMate, Stone & Chalk and Inco, are going to be looking for startups where they can do job placements. Likewise, if you're someone that's seeking a job, we highly encourage you to reach out to those programs, all with very different program offerings. And we hope you will, through that, be able to land your dream job at a startup. To our audience today, thank you very much for joining us. Please keep an eye out for people who have completed the programs. They'll undoubtedly become really important parts of the talent pipeline for your startups this year and into the future. In a couple of weeks, on the 13th of May, as part of LaunchVic's ongoing work in talent, we're going to host another webinar for anyone wanting to work at a startup and scale up. And as part of this, we're going to be examining what it takes to work at a startup and make that transition from a traditional corporate or a university student into a startup role. Thank you, as always, to the fabulous LaunchVic team for pulling together today's webinar. Final thanks go to the panel for such spectacular insights, and thank you to everyone for attending. Hope you enjoy your afternoon.